The CRTC wants to know how radio, TV, and digital platforms in Canada can best meet the needs of Indigenous viewers, listeners, and content creators. Join the conversation today at crtc.gc.ca/indigenous-broadcasting.
A message from the Government of Canada.
Le CRTC veut savoir comment la radio, la télévision et les plateformes numériques au Canada peuvent mieux répondre aux besoins des spectateurs, auditeurs et créateurs de contenu autochtones. Joignez-vous à la conversation aujourd'hui au crtc.gc.ca/radiodiffusion-d'union autochtone.
Un message du gouvernement du Canada.
Tonight on Nation to Nation, Green Party leader Elizabeth May says environmental racism is real and is happening now. That's why she's hopeful her private member's bill C-226 will pass a vote in the Senate.
A lot of Canadians think it doesn't exist, but it's been recognized, strangely enough, in the United States since 1994.
Senator Kim Pate has been a longtime advocate for equality. She's been pushing to have a bill in place that would automatically remove criminal records for some.
We would have a process that, like some other countries in the world, would allow the record to expire without people having to apply, without having to pay money.
And columnist Rose LeMay discusses her thoughts on pretendians and fake imitation Indigenous art.
Not too many generations ago to hear about our art being uncivilized, to being not worthy of the real art and now being mimicked.
Ani, welcome to Nation. I'm Annette Francis. A private member's bill that was introduced a year ago by Green Party leader Elizabeth May is closer to becoming law. Bill C-226 may be reaching a third reading this week in the Senate. The proposed act would call on the Minister of Environment to develop a national strategy to assess, prevent, and address environmental racism. Elizabeth May joins me now to talk about the status of the bill and what it could mean. Welcome to Nation.
Well, thank you so much, Megwitch, and thanks for giving this issue some attention.
This bill has had quite a long history. It was first introduced by Lenore Zan, a Liberal MP, and you took over it after it died due to an election.
Yeah, Lenore Zan did me the honor of asking me to be her official seconder. She's a Nova Scotian. I originally started working on environmental racism, and we were working on issues in Nova Scotia because I was a Cape Bretoner before I was a Vancouver Islander. Long story, never mind. But Lenore asked me to second her bill when she introduced it into Parliament in 2021 in the spring. And then we had, unfortunately, that election, and Lenore lost her seat, and the bill had to start from scratch. So I've been very honored to be the sponsor of the bill, but grateful to Lenore Zan for all her work, plus work of people like Dr. Ingrid Waldron, who's been one of the leading voices for confronting environmental racism from her work on racialized communities, marginalized communities, and Indigenous communities that bear an unbelievably heavy burden of ignoring laws to protect human beings from pollution if those human beings are Indigenous or racialized.
How close is this bill, and how much support does it have so far?
Well, very, very fortunately, we've passed all stages in the House of Commons, which for a private member's bill is a lot, so it's closer to being law. When we passed it on to the Senate, I asked Senator Mary Jane McCallum, who's a senator from Winnipeg, and she's of Cree heritage, and she has done a magnificent job. The Senate, of course, these days is mostly independents, and they're in somewhat different groupings, but Senator McCallum managed to cobble together the support to get it all the way through committee without any amendments, and then get passed at report stage in the Senate. So we're inches away. Senate procedures, I find them very confusing, but fingers are crossed. We may even have a vote today and get the bill through, and then the only last step is procedural, is royal assent. It's had a lot of support. I thank my NDP colleagues, a lot of Liberal colleagues, a lot of independent Senate colleagues, but mostly the grassroots groups across this country, voices like from Aamjiwnaang First Nation, from like Ellen Gabriel from Gazatage, people right across this country who are experiencing the effects of environmental racism. And to put the positive message behind it, this bill is about getting environmental justice.
What is environmental racism?
It's well documented. A lot of Canadians think it doesn't exist, but it's been recognized, strangely enough, in the United States since 1994. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has had a large program confronting environmental justice. In brief, it's when marginalized, racialized, Indigenous communities and also people living in poverty are exposed to heavier burdens of environmental contaminants, of pollution, of having rights to a healthy environment infringed because of deep-set institutionalized racism.
Very heavy burdens. Aamjiwnaang First Nation, some members were not even able to go outside of their homes due to toxic benzene levels. Grassy Narrows has for decades dealt with mercury poisoning, and today a report is coming out on the continued mercury poisoning in Wabigoon River. How much teeth would this bill have for those communities?
It has promise, but I'm going to be honest here. Let's get the bill passed, but that won't end the fight, because the bill requires the Canadian government to come up with a program, an effective program for environmental justice. We're going to have to fight them. We're going to have to push them every step of the way to make sure it's effective. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Environmental Justice Program is billions of dollars a year to make sure that marginalized communities get access to lawyers, epidemiologists, toxicologists, the scientists you need to say, this is an unfair burden, we need and demand action. So depending on, it'll be up to then the government of the day to have a strategy for environmental justice, and it has to be effective, it has to deliver equity, it has to mean that places like Kanesatake can't continue to have toxic waste, illegal dumping in the community that would never be accepted in a settler culture community. That's the test. Could you imagine this, whatever this is, could you imagine tailings ponds leaching all the pollutants from the oil sands in a backyard in Calgary? No. That happens in Cree communities. It doesn't happen in wealthy communities. So we need to make sure that nowhere in Canada is unsafe, that no Canadian, Indigenous, Black, racialized, no one should be put in an environment which jeopardizes their health. And that's the essence of environmental justice.
Why is it taking so long? You mentioned it's been 1994 since the states has had their programs in place. Why is Canada so far behind?
Oh, I think a lot of it is just plain denial. I still get a lot of blowback from even some MPs that there's no such thing as environmental racism. You made it up. It's some woke term. It's real. It's documented. As I said, Dr. Ingrid Waldron has written a book on There's Something in the Water. People can find it, by the way, for settler culture Canadians who are not aware of this. Netflix, thanks to Elliot Page. There's a film documentary, There's Something in the Water, about the community in Shelburne, a Black community in Nova Scotia, or Indigenous communities of Pictou Landing in Nova Scotia. There's lots of evidence. And for people who don't know about it, then they realize, why are we so far behind? Why haven't we acted? And now we are going to act.
And what's it going to take to get there?
Well, the bill's passage in royal assent is going to be a very strong directive, not optional, to the federal government to develop a program in environmental justice. And developing that must be inclusive. The Indigenous voices and the Indigenous warriors, people who fought so hard, have to be at the table. Black voices, Indigenous voices, racialized voices, and communities that have been fighting to say, this is what we need. If we mean environmental justice, then we have to have a program that actually delivers, and that means funding, that means it's inclusive, and it means it empowers communities to reject being treated as second-class citizens and all the toxic dumps go on their lands. No, never again.
All right, Miigwech, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Stay tuned. After the break, we'll talk to Senator Kim Pate about her private member's bill that would automatically expunge an offender's criminal record after a fixed period of time.
Hello, I'm Rick Harp, host of APTN News Brief, a daily podcast version of the nightly broadcast of APTN National News. Available on all major podcast platforms, APTN News Brief is your quick way to hear the headlines every weekday morning. Learn more at aptnnews.ca/podcasts.
Ani, welcome back. An act aimed at automatically removing a criminal record is another step closer to becoming law. Senator Kim Pate introduced Bill S-212 in the Senate in November 2021. This week, the bill reached the third reading when it was debated in the Senate. Senator Kim Pate joins me now. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
When you first introduced Bill S-212, some experts said this could be the most significant justice reform. How so?
Well, one of the things it does is, for the first time since records were introduced and record expiry was, or the idea of a pardon was introduced, we would have a process that, like some other countries in the world, would allow the record to expire without people having to apply, without having to pay money, go through the application process and all of the costs that go along with it, and then be able to move on from their, move on with their lives and not have the impediment of a criminal record, which we know not only impacts employment and volunteer opportunities, but increasingly rental agreements, increasing even access to education. And, as happened during the pandemic, as I was trying to help some families get health care for their loved ones, even long-term care facilities often are doing criminal record checks. So it would allow people who have lived for, the bill right now would be 2 years, which is the original time frame that existed when pardons were first introduced, after the end of a sentence for a summary conviction offense, which is usually less serious, and after 5 years after the end of sentence for an indictable offense, be able to move on with their lives and be able to truthfully say they did not have a criminal record.
You have stated that the record relief falls disproportionately on most economically and racially marginalized, especially those of African descent and Indigenous peoples. How does this currently affect their lives, and how many people are affected by this?
Well, 1 in 10 Canadians has a criminal record, and not that many apply for record expiry or before that for pardons. And a lot of people, start the process and find it too complicated and difficult to do. In fact, this government gave out millions of dollars to organizations to try and help people get pardons because the take-up was so low. And disproportionately, it's, of course, people who are the poorest, and disproportionately, it's Indigenous people and other racialized people, Black people, people of African descent, people with mental health issues, who are trying to move on with their lives and may have very few dollars. And so the fact that they then have to use that to, becomes a real vicious cycle of how do we get a pardon when we don't have the money? If the money's there, we want to use it for rent, to put a roof over heads, to feed ourselves, our families, to try and get ahead in whatever way we can. It's not like a lot of people have a bunch of money lying around, especially after they've had the impediment. And we know that for many of the Indigenous people, many people were first in child welfare involvement. Many of the folks who are in the system also were in residential school or first or second generation. So we know that the residential school, child welfare, 60 scoop pipeline into the prison is real. And so it becomes this vicious cycle also that doesn't allow people to stop and start again and have a fresh start, which so many people want. And when I was in Alberta years ago, when I was working with young people and men, Mr. Justice Causey, as he then was, did a review of Indigenous men only. And by the time Indigenous men reached the age of 30, they indicated that 9 out of 10 had criminal records. And that's huge. That could make a huge difference for people who, lots of us, we all make mistakes in adolescence and as young adults. Not all of us get criminalized, and not all of us live with that for the rest of our lives. And so it's trying to make it a slightly more equal starting point for some folks.
What about certain convictions such as first-degree murder, crimes against children, or when someone has been deemed a repeat violent offender? How would this act handle these offenses?
Well, the people who are serving indeterminate sentences or life sentences for murder, dangerous people have been labeled dangerous offenders, probably, well, their sentence never ends, so there would never be this 5-year period after the end of sentence. So it doesn't apply to them. And there's exceptions for child sexual offenses and serious sexual offenses as well, because of the nature of the vulnerabilities of population. So, those would be exempted. And there are, but, virtually everybody else should be able to access. If they've had criminal involvement in between, then they wouldn't be eligible until they've had the crime-free period. And all of the research shows, and part of the reason the government has been on side to lower the wait times, as well as looking at some of these measures, is because all the research shows that when people have been out of prison for 3 to 5 years and not been involved in any other criminal activity, they are, even if they have a record, they're no more likely to commit a criminal offense.
There has been opposition to this bill. What will it take to bring more people on board with the change?
Well, I think it'll, in the Senate already, there's been an amendment from the Conservatives to go reverse the wait times, take it back to what the Conservative government introduced in 2012, and increase the wait times back to 5 and 10 years respectively from what the bill proposes, which is 2 and 5 years, which incidentally was insisted upon by the Conservatives they actually wanted it to be 2 and 5 years when the laws were first introduced. So that's an impediment. Some people think anybody with a criminal record should never be able to move on, ignoring the fact that the criminal law doesn't apply equally to everybody. In theory it does, but in practice we know that our prisons are full of the people that every other system fails, and that if you if you have resources, power, privilege, you can lawyer up, you can get a whole bunch of professionals experts to talk about everything from your mental health to your past history.
How soon could this become law?
Well, it has to finish going through third reading in the Senate and then has to go to the House of Commons. Member of Parliament Judy Sgro, a Liberal member of Parliament, has indicated that, she's already flagged that she will pick up the bill. But the reality is where it still has to go through that process there. And depending on what happens, whether there's an election in the interim, it could end up. Previous iterations of this bill have died on the order paper, and so because an election was called.
Okay, Miigwech, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all of your work.
Stick around. After the break, we'll hear from Hill Times columnist Rose LeMay about cultural appropriation and imitation art.
I'm Kathleen Martin, a reporter with APTN News. Homeless, houseless, shelterless people, they aren't hard to find in Winnipeg. They're on the sidewalks, in bus shelters, and down alleyways. They're living in tents and squatting in empty buildings. They're even sleeping in abandoned cars. But who are they? Hear their stories in my new 5-part podcast called Our Relatives. Listen on your favorite player.
Ani, welcome back. Indigenous identity fraud has been a hot topic of discussion lately. Last week, the topic brought Inuit, Métis, and First Nation groups to the table in Winnipeg as a part of an identity summit. According to Hill Times columnist Rose LeMay, it was a major step forward in healing. Identity fraud isn't the only issue on the rise. Fake Indigenous art and cultural appropriation are also becoming more commonplace. Rose LeMay joins me now. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Did you watch the Identity Fraud Summit last week? What were your thoughts?
I did watch almost all of it, and I was so impressed that First Nations and Inuit and Métis came together, found common ground, and perhaps even reignited the oldest treaties we have, which are not actually with settlers, they're with each other. And it felt like going back to the premise that we all have responsibility to each other. And I was so impressed with it all. It did really remind me of Maori, when Maori come together and they talk about why we are here, how on the shoulders of our ancestors, the heroes that we have in our genealogy. And that's actually what happened in Winnipeg. So it really just filled my heart.
Your latest column is titled the Day Indigenous Peoples Took a Major Step Forward in Healing. How are these discussions healing?
I believe they're healing because, at least at this summit, and so many of the discussions that I hear now are based on our sovereignty, are based in our old laws, that predate Canada and the Constitution. And so it is for us, I guess, I see it as coming back to who we actually are and opposing the very colonial thing that has occurred for us, where the federal government and provinces and territories sometimes pitted us against each other, First Nations against Métis, against Inuit. And so for us to turn away from that and say, no, that's not who we are at all, I think is actually very healing.
But is there a danger in that happening, something like that happening again, like summits like this one in Winnipeg? Could it lead to legitimate Indigenous people fighting amongst each other and then in turn make it easier for governments to use the divide and conquer tactics?
Well, I suspect in other times and other times in our history that it may have had more risk. I do believe it actually has much less risk now that we see a common enemy. Pretendian organizations have a much huger impact on First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And unfortunately, there's nothing like a common threat that might bring us together. Is there risk? There's a little bit, but I don't think there's nearly as much risk as there was, say, in the Kelowna Accord back in the early 2000s. There was a bit of conflict around that. It took a lot of work, but now I didn't see any conflict really in this summit, in the organization of it, in the final declaration. There was some good discussion on how to make it stronger, but it was amazing to see.
Your article mentions a totem pole at the entrance of Algonquin Park. Why were you reminded of this?
Well, it has stuck in my mind since the last time I went to Algonquin Park and drove through and saw this totem pole, and I can't even describe the feelings I had. I come from the West Coast. I come from Taco River Tlingit First Nation. The totem poles are part of our knowledge system, part of our responsibilities of how we share stories, and to see it so displaced. But it was more than that. It was a mishmash of design that had no basic meaning. It was appropriation. That totem pole is appropriation, a misappropriation of something which has such deep meaning for West Coast First Nations. I was pretty offended actually, and it reminded me of how this all kind of comes together: Pretendian individuals, organizations, and now art. It's all seems to be a bit of a threat.
Fake Inuit art is also an issue. NDP MP Lori Inuit is concerned about imitations being sold in tourist shops. Many of them are made in China. How do these types of fakes affect authentic Inuit or Indigenous artists?
Well, I suspect there is quite an income hit to have all of this fake art circulating. On one hand, it is quite a threat for artists who generally don't make a lot of money, especially if they sell through stores in the South, and stores might take a cut, and it's artists don't get nearly as much as they deserve. I guess I'm also looking at this though is can what a shift it is for us as Indigenous peoples to not too many generations ago to hear about our art being uncivilized, to being not worthy of the real art and now being mimicked. That's a huge shift. And somehow we have to look at both sides of that.
Inuit is suggesting a legislative response. Do you think that it should go that far?
I don't know much about the bill that is being proposed. I do know that much of the art world struggles with fakery. There's been museums who found the majority of their paintings were fake recently. And so it's not unique to Indigenous peoples. I don't know how law could impact on fake Indigenous art. There must already be laws, is there not? There would be in Europe, but there must be laws. This is fraud. This is like making up fake money. And so I suspect there are already laws about it. But again, I haven't actually seen the bill and seen how it might actually roll out.
Okay, Miigwech, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcasts at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Annette Francis, miigwech, and have a good night.
APTN presents a captivating journey into the heart of the North with our latest podcast, The Place That Thaws.
Some areas that used to be safe are no longer safe.
Hosted by me, Danielle Parody. Join us as we uncover the intricacies of life on a changing coast. Subscribe and listen to The Place That Thaws.